Rain had been falling over Maplewood since sunrise. Not the kind of storm that kept people indoors. Just a quiet drizzle that painted the streets with a silver shine. Traffic moved slowly through the town. Store owners swept water away from their entrances. Parents hurried children toward school beneath colorful umbrellas. And Officer James Fields began another ordinary patrol. He had started his assignment in Maplewood 5 days ago. James had worn the uniform for only 3 years, long enough to understand that most days were uneventful. Most calls involved locked cars, lost pets, minor traffic accidents, or helping elderly residents carry groceries to their front doors. James liked that. He hadn't joined the police department because he wanted excitement. He had joined because he believed every community deserved people who cared. His patrol car rolled quietly through Oak Street. The windshield wipers moved back and forth with steady rhythm. Then something caught his attention. An old blue bicycle. The rider moved carefully through the morning traffic. His gray jacket was faded from years of use. His trousers were neatly pressed despite their age. A worn leather satchel hung across his shoulder. The bicycle itself looked even older. Blue paint covered most of the frame, but years of sunlight had softened the color. Several small scratches marked the handlebars. The rear basket had been repaired with thin metal wire. Everything about the bicycle suggested it had been used and cared for many years. James watched as the elderly rider stopped at a crosswalk. He waited patiently while two children crossed the street. Only after they reached the sidewalk safely did he continue. James smiled. Then another detail caught his eye. There was no rear reflector. He slowed the patrol car. Traffic regulations required every bicycle to carry one, especially on rainy mornings like this. It was a small violation, but an important one. Visibility saved lives. James activated his blue lights. The elderly rider looked over his shoulder. He carefully guided the bicycle toward the curb without hesitation. No sudden movements. No frustration. No attempt to argue. He simply parked the bicycle, placed one foot on the sidewalk, and waited with a gentle smile. James stepped from the patrol car. "Good morning, sir." The old man smiled warmly. "Good morning, officer." His voice was calm, friendly, as though they were neighbors, meeting outside a grocery store. James returned the smile. "I'm afraid I've stopped you, because your bicycle is missing its rear reflector." The elderly man looked behind him, then nodded. "I was hoping you wouldn't notice." James laughed softly. "I usually do. So I've discovered." The two men shared a quiet smile. James looked at the bicycle more closely. It was remarkably clean. Every moving part appeared well maintained. The chain had been freshly oiled. The tires were properly inflated. The brakes looked almost new. Whoever owned this bicycle clearly took pride in caring for it. Everything perfectly in order, except the missing reflector. "I'm sorry," the old man said. "I've been meaning to replace it." "What happened to the old one?" He looked almost embarrassed. "It finally cracked last week. I ordered another one, but the delivery keeps getting delayed." James nodded. That sounded believable. Nothing else about the bicycle suggested neglect. "I'm Officer James Fields." The elderly man extended his hand. "Samuel Turner." James shook it. Samuel's handshake was firm despite his age. "May I see some identification, Mr. Turner?" "Of course." Samuel reached into the worn leather satchel. Everything inside was carefully organized. An old wallet, a folded newspaper, a small notebook, a pair of reading glasses. He handed over his driver's license. James glanced at it. Samuel Turner, age 78. Address only a few miles away. Everything was in order. James handed the license back. You've lived here a long time. Samuel smiled. Long enough to remember, when this road was still gravel. James looked around the busy street. It was difficult to imagine. Things have changed. They certainly have. Samuel looked toward the row of small businesses across the street. But people still need kindness. The sentence seemed simple, almost casual. Yet something about the way Samuel said it lingered with James. Most people filled silence with complaints. About traffic, about weather, about politics. Samuel didn't. He simply observed the world around him with quiet appreciation. James glanced once more at the missing reflector. Normally, he would issue a written warning. It was standard procedure. Instead, he looked toward a bicycle shop on the opposite corner. The owner was unlocking the front door. An idea came to him. Mr. Turner. Samuel looked up. Would you mind waiting here for just a moment? I've waited 78 years. I think I can manage another minute. James laughed. I'll be right back. He crossed the street and entered the bicycle shop. 5 minutes later he returned, carrying a small package. Samuel looked confused. James opened it. Inside was a bright red reflector. I hope you don't mind. Samuel blinked. You bought one? James shrugged. It cost less than my morning coffee. Then he knelt beside the bicycle. Using a small screwdriver, borrowed from the shop owner, he carefully attached the reflector beneath the seat. Now the old bicycle met every safety requirement. James stood and brushed rainwater from his uniform. There. Samuel stared at the bicycle. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he looked at James. His eyes were noticeably brighter than before. You didn't have to do that. I know, but I'd rather see you riding safely tomorrow than writing you another warning. For a long moment Samuel simply smiled. Not the polite smile people offer strangers. A genuine smile. One that reached his eyes. Finally he extended his hand once more. Thank you, Officer Fields. James shook it. It was my pleasure. Samuel placed one foot on the pedal, then paused. You know. James looked up. In 40 years of riding this bicycle, I've been stopped several times. James waited. You are the first officer who solved the problem, instead of simply pointing it out. For a moment neither man spoke. Then Samuel nodded once. Have a wonderful day. And you, Mr. Turner. James watched as the old blue bicycle disappeared into the gentle rain. The new reflector caught the morning light with every turn of the wheels. He smiled to himself, then climbed back into the patrol car. It had been a small act, one he would likely forget by the end of the week. What James could not possibly know was that before the month was over, that simple traffic stop would become the most important conversation of his entire career. Life in Maplewood followed a comfortable rhythm. People opened their shops at nearly the same hour every morning. Children filled the sidewalks before school. Retirees gathered outside the bakery with coffee cups, warming their hands. And almost every day Officer James Fields saw the old blue bicycle now. Sometimes Samuel Turner rode through the town square, sometimes along the river path, sometimes through neighborhoods where the streets were lined with old maple trees, always at an unhurried pace, always smiling. The bicycle never seemed to be carrying much, only the worn leather satchel, and sometimes a loaf of fresh bread, or a small paper bag from the pharmacy. At first, James barely thought about it, until he began noticing something unusual. Everywhere Samuel stopped, people smiled. Not polite smiles, real ones. One Tuesday morning, James parked near the elementary school while monitoring traffic. Parents hurried children across the crosswalk. School buses pulled away. Then he spotted Samuel. The old man had stopped beside a little boy. The child's bicycle chain had slipped off the gears. His father knelt beside it, clearly frustrated. Grease covered his hands. The chain refused to stay in place. Without saying a word, Samuel leaned his own bicycle against a fence. He removed a clean cloth from his satchel, knelt beside the child's bicycle. Within less than 2 minutes, the chain was back where it belonged. The little boy's face lit up. His father reached for his wallet. Samuel simply shook his head. No. The father insisted. Please. Samuel smiled. Next time someone needs help, you help them. The father slowly lowered his wallet, then nodded. I will. Samuel climbed back onto his bicycle. The little boy waved enthusiastically. So long, Mr. Turner. Samuel waved back without looking. Ride safely. James watched the entire exchange from across the street. No one applauded. No one filmed it. Samuel rode away as though nothing remarkable had happened. The next afternoon, James responded to a welfare check. An elderly widow named Mrs. Harrison had missed her regular visit to the community center. A concerned neighbor had called. When James arrived, he found Mrs. Harrison perfectly safe. She was sitting comfortably in her living room, laughing. Across from her sat Samuel. A chessboard rested between them. The kitchen smelled of fresh vegetable soup. Mrs. Harrison smiled when she saw James. Officer Fields. I hope I didn't worry everyone. James smiled. Your neighbors were concerned. Samuel stood. I should have called someone. Mrs. Harrison gently patted his hand. You've done enough already. James looked around. Several grocery bags rested neatly beside the kitchen counter. Medicine bottles had been organized in a small tray. A broken cabinet hinge had obviously been repaired. Everything looked cared for. As James prepared to leave, Mrs. Harrison quietly said something that stayed with him. I don't know what this town would do without Samuel. James glanced toward the old man. Samuel looked almost embarrassed. Oh, there are plenty of people more useful than me. Mrs. Harrison laughed. I've met most of them. They're not. Samuel only smiled. 2 days later, James stopped at Miller's hardware store. The owner, Frank Miller, stood outside arranging flower pots. He noticed Samuel locking his bicycle nearby. Morning, Sam. Morning, Frank. Frank disappeared inside the store. A moment later, he returned carrying a small cardboard box. I finally found the screws you needed. Samuel's face brightened. You found them? Took me 2 weeks. Samuel accepted the box carefully. Thank you. Frank waved dismissively. You fixed enough things around this town. It's the least I could do. James raised an eyebrow. What are the screws for? Samuel smiled. A park bench. James looked confused. The city asked you to repair one? Samuel chuckled softly. No, it just looked lonely. James laughed. You repair park benches when they need repairing. Frank grinned. He also repairs birdhouses, garden gates, children's wagons, mailbox posts. James looked at Samuel. Do people hire you? Samuel seemed genuinely surprised. No, I just don't like seeing broken things. There was no pride in his voice, no attempt to impress anyone. He simply stated it, as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. That evening, James found himself thinking about the conversation. His own grandfather had always said something similar. If you can leave a place a little better than you found it, do it. Maybe that was all Samuel was doing. One small repair at a time. The following Saturday, the town hosted its weekly farmers market. James walked patrol through the crowded square. Fresh fruit, flowers, homemade bread. Children chasing pigeons between the market stalls. Near the fountain, he spotted Samuel again. This time he wasn't repairing anything. He was sitting quietly on a bench, eating a simple sandwich. An elderly woman approached him. She embraced him warmly, then another. Soon, a young couple stopped to greet him. A firefighter shook his hand. A postal worker waved enthusiastically. Even the mayor's assistant crossed the street, simply to say hello. James had never seen anything quite like it. Samuel wasn't famous. No crowd gathered around him. There were no photographs, no speeches, just person after person, stopping for a moment, sharing a smile, before continuing with their day. It wasn't admiration. It felt more like gratitude. Late that afternoon, James returned to the station. As he poured himself a cup of coffee, his partner, Officer Rachel Collins, noticed the thoughtful expression on his face. You've been awfully interested in somebody lately, James smiled. An old man on a bicycle. Rachel laughed. That sounds like the beginning of a strange police report. James leaned against the counter. His name is Samuel Turner. Rachel's smile softened immediately. You met Sam? You know him? Rachel looked almost surprised. Everyone knows Sam. James frowned. I don't. Rachel stirred her coffee. You will. James waited. She simply smiled. Trust me. Then she walked away, leaving James with even more questions than before. Who exactly was Samuel Turner? And why did it seem that the entire town knew something he didn't? The following Monday began much like every other. James started his morning patrol shortly before 7. Clouds still covered the sky, but the rain had finally stopped. The streets shimmered beneath the first hints of sunlight. As he drove through Maplewood, he found himself looking for one particular bicycle. He smiled at the thought. Only 2 weeks earlier, Samuel Turner had been just another traffic stop. Now, without quite understanding why, James hoped to see him again. He didn't have to wait long. Near Riverside Park, the familiar blue bicycle stood beside a wooden bench. Samuel knelt in the grass. A small toolbox rested beside him. James parked nearby. What are we fixing today? Samuel looked up and smiled. The bench. James glanced at it. It doesn't look broken. Samuel stood and gently pushed against one of the wooden slats. It rocked slightly. Not yet. James nodded. So you're fixing it before someone gets hurt. Samuel smiled. That's usually easier. Together they tightened a few loose bolts, replaced one weathered screw, and within 10 minutes, the bench looked exactly the same. Only now it was safe. A young mother pushing a stroller walked past. She thanked both men, then continued on her way. James laughed. We're getting credit together now. Samuel chuckled. I'll happily share it. As James prepared to leave, he noticed the toolbox. It had obviously seen decades of use. The metal corners were scratched. The handle had been wrapped with leather years ago. Every tool inside had its own place. You've had this a long time. Samuel looked down at the box. My father gave it to me. Still works. The best things usually do. James nodded thoughtfully. Before climbing back into his patrol car, he looked at Samuel. You spend a lot of time helping people. Samuel seemed surprised by that. I suppose. Why? Samuel looked toward the river. The morning breeze moved gently through the trees. When I was a little boy, my father used to tell me something. James waited. If you walk past a problem, and you have the ability to solve it, it becomes your problem. James smiled. I've never heard that before. My father wasn't famous, Samuel said, but he was wise. That sentence stayed with James for the rest of the day. 3 days later, James received a call about a minor traffic accident. Nothing serious. Two vehicles had bumped into one another outside the public library. By the time he arrived, the drivers were already exchanging insurance information. No injuries. No arguments. Routine. As James completed the report, he noticed Samuel across the street. The old man wasn't watching the accident. He was helping the library's groundskeeper gather books that had fallen from an overturned donation cart. Children's books, history books, cookbooks. One by one, Samuel brushed away the dust before placing each book back into the cart. The groundskeeper smiled. I could have done this. Samuel handed him another stack. I know, but it goes faster together. James finished the accident report, then quietly watched for another minute. Samuel never looked toward the police cars, never tried to attract attention. He simply helped, then rode away. That Friday, James stopped at Molly's bakery before starting the afternoon shift. The smell of fresh bread filled the small shop. Customers chatted while waiting their turn. Behind the counter, Mrs. Molly Henderson smiled as James entered. The usual? You know me too well. She laughed. I know everybody. As she placed a coffee on the counter, she glanced through the front window. Right on time. James turned. Samuel was locking his bicycle outside. A few moments later, he stepped inside. Good afternoon, Molly. Good afternoon, Sam. Without asking, she placed 2 fresh loaves of bread on the counter. Samuel paid, then added 3 more. James looked puzzled. Big family? Samuel smiled. No, Molly answered instead. Mrs. Alvarez broke her ankle. So did Mr. Peterson's wife. And old George refuses to admit he can't cook. Samuel shrugged gently. They shouldn't have to worry about dinner. James couldn't help smiling. You do this every Friday? Samuel looked genuinely confused. Doesn't everyone? Molly laughed warmly. No, Sam. They don't. Samuel carefully placed the loaves into the basket on his bicycle. As he prepared to leave, a little girl entered the bakery, holding her grandmother's hand. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old. The moment she saw Samuel, her face lit up. Mr. Turner. Samuel smiled. Hello, Emily. The little girl ran over and hugged him tightly. Samuel knelt carefully so she wouldn't have to reach. Still riding your bicycle? She nodded enthusiastically. Every day. Helmet? She proudly pointed to the pink helmet, hanging from the handlebars outside. Samuel grinned. Excellent. The grandmother smiled at James. He taught all three of my grandchildren how to ride. James looked back at Samuel. You teach children? Samuel stood. Sometimes. Emily interrupted. He says everybody falls, but everybody gets another try. Samuel looked slightly embarrassed. I may have said something like that. The grandmother smiled. He says it every lesson. Emily waved goodbye. So long, Mr. Turner. Samuel waved back. Keep practicing. After they left, James watched Samuel ride away once more. The little girl's words echoed in his mind. Everybody falls. Everybody gets another try. They were simple sentences, the kind people remembered long after they forgot who had spoken them. That evening, James sat alone in the patrol car overlooking Maplewood. The town seemed unusually peaceful. Streetlights reflected softly across the river. Families walked their dogs. Children laughed in front yards. Somewhere in the distance, he spotted the familiar red reflector beneath Samuel's bicycle, flashing each time when it caught the light. James smiled, then spoke quietly to himself. Who are you, Samuel Turner? He still didn't know the answer, but he was beginning to realize something else. Whatever Samuel had done during his life, it had nothing to do with money, or status, or recognition. Somehow, the old man had simply made life better for everyone around him. And James had the growing feeling that he had only seen the smallest part of the story. Monday morning brought clear skies for the first time in nearly 2 weeks. Sunlight filled Maplewood. Shop owners opened their windows. Children laughed as they walked to school. The whole town seemed brighter. James noticed something else. People smiled more than usual. He wasn't sure whether the weather deserved the credit, or whether Maplewood had always been this way. As his patrol car rolled through Main Street, dispatch interrupted the quiet morning. Unit 12. James reached for the radio. Go ahead. We've received a report of a stray dog near Cedar Avenue. I'm on my way. James arrived 5 minutes later. The dog wasn't difficult to find. A frightened golden retriever stood beside the sidewalk. Its leash dragged behind it. Several passing cars slowed. Nobody wanted to frighten the animal. James stepped carefully from the patrol car. It's all right. The dog backed away, its tail tucked nervously beneath its body. James crouched sideways, speaking softly, just as his training had taught him. The dog hesitated. Then its ears lifted. It looked beyond James. James turned. There was Samuel, riding the familiar blue bicycle. He stopped several yards away, climbed off quietly, and without speaking, knelt on one knee. The dog's entire body changed. Its tail began wagging. Within seconds, it trotted straight towards Samuel. The old man smiled gently. Well, I wondered where you'd wandered off to. James stared. You know this dog? Samuel scratched behind its ears. Her name is Daisy. James blinked. She's yours? Samuel laughed. Oh no. She belongs to the Wilson family. You know everyone's dog? Samuel shrugged. I know most of them. James couldn't help laughing. I suppose you do. Together they walked Daisy home. Mrs. Wilson opened the front door before they reached the porch. Relief washed across her face. There you are. She hugged Daisy tightly, then looked at Samuel. I should have guessed she'd find you. Samuel smiled. She simply took the scenic route. Mrs. Wilson laughed, then thanked James too. As the two men walked back toward the bicycles, James finally asked the question that had been growing inside him for days. Can I ask you something? Samuel looked at him. Of course. Who are you? Samuel laughed so unexpectedly that James began laughing too. I'm Samuel Turner. You know what I mean. Samuel looked ahead. The morning breeze moved gently through the maple trees. I've lived here a long time. I've gathered that. And I try to be useful. James smiled. I've gathered that too. But everyone knows you. Samuel thought quietly for several moments, then answered, I've simply had more time than most. James wasn't convinced. No, there's something else. Samuel smiled. Perhaps. But I don't think it matters very much. Before James could ask another question, a pickup truck slowed beside the curb. The driver rolled down his window. Morning, Sam. Samuel waved. Morning, Bill. You still coming by this afternoon? I wouldn't miss it. Bill smiled. Good. We've got 6 waiting. Then he drove away. James frowned. 6 what? Samuel climbed back onto the bicycle. You'll find out. Before James could stop him, Samuel pedaled away. That afternoon, curiosity finally won. James stopped by the police station's records office. Not because Samuel had done anything wrong. Quite the opposite. He simply wanted to know more. The civilian clerk looked up from her computer. What can I do for you? I'm looking for some background information. Name? Samuel Turner. She silently lifted her eyebrows and then typed for several moments. Then frowned. That's odd. What? I expected at least a little bit more. James looked over the counter. There are hardly any records. No criminal history. No civil complaints. No traffic violations. She smiled. Well, one. James laughed. The missing reflector. She smiled. I think he survived. James nodded. I was the officer. The clerk leaned back. You know, my father always talks about Samuel. James looked interested. What does he say? She smiled. He says this town has hundreds of volunteers, but only one Mr. Turner. James sighed. That's exactly the kind of answer everybody gives me. She laughed. I know. As James walked back toward the front lobby, Police Chief Robert Hayes stepped through the entrance. A respected officer with nearly 30 years of service. Morning, James. Morning, Chief. The chief noticed the thoughtful look on James' face. Everything all right? James hesitated, then smiled. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. Who is Samuel Turner? The chief stopped walking. For a brief moment, he simply smiled. Not because the question amused him, because he remembered asking exactly the same question years earlier. You met Sam. I've met him several times. And? I can't figure him out. Chief Hayes nodded slowly. No, most people can't. James waited. Surely, the chief would finally explain. Instead, the older man placed a hand gently on James' shoulder. There's a community service awards ceremony next Thursday. James nodded. I know. I'll be there. Chief Hayes smiled. Good. Don't miss it. Then he continued walking toward his office, leaving James standing alone in the hallway, more curious than ever. The answers were finally coming. James simply didn't know that they would change the way he looked at his badge for the rest of his life. Thursday afternoon arrived with warm sunshine. For the first time in days, James found himself thinking about Samuel before his shift had even begun. Not because he expected another traffic stop, quite the opposite. He hoped to see him. Late that afternoon, James drove along the eastern edge of Maplewood. Near the old railway station, a narrow side street caught his attention. The familiar blue bicycle stood outside a small brick building. Its windows were open. Laughter drifted into the street. James slowed. Above the entrance hung a simple wooden sign. Second wheels. The letters had been painted by hand many years earlier. The paint had faded, but someone had carefully repainted each letter over time. Without really thinking, James parked across the street. He stepped quietly toward the open doorway. The room was unlike anything he expected. Old bicycles stood neatly arranged along one wall. Some were rusty. Some were missing wheels. Others looked beyond repair. Workbench after workbench filled the room. Tools hung in perfect order. The air carried the familiar smell of machine oil, fresh wood, and old rubber tires. At the far end of the workshop, Samuel stood beside a teenage boy, perhaps 15 years old. The boy struggled to adjust a bicycle brake. It keeps rubbing. Samuel smiled. What does it tell you? The boy frowned. It tells me I'm doing something wrong. Samuel chuckled. Machines don't complain. They communicate. The boy looked again, carefully this time. A few moments later, his face brightened. Oh, the wheel isn't centered. Samuel nodded. There you go. James noticed something. Samuel hadn't fixed the bicycle. He had taught someone else how to fix it. Nearby, an older woman painted a bicycle frame bright yellow. A retired firefighter adjusted handlebars. Two high school students cleaned chains. Everyone worked together. Nobody seemed to be in charge, yet everything moved with quiet purpose. Bill, the man from the pickup truck, looked up and noticed James. Officer Fields. James smiled. I hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all. Bill walked over. You finally found us. James glanced around the room. So this is what the six were. Bill nodded. 6 bicycles. James looked puzzled. For sale? Bill laughed. Samuel overheard him. No. James turned. Then what happens to them? Samuel picked up a small bicycle helmet from the workbench. He brushed away a little dust, then smiled. 6 children will learn to ride. James looked around the room again. Every bicycle, every tool, every volunteer. Everything made a little more sense. You give them away? Samuel nodded. If a child needs a bicycle, and a family can't afford one, they come here. James slowly walked past rows of finished bicycles. Each one looked almost new. Bright paint, new tires, working lights, fresh reflectors. Every single bicycle carried a small brass tag attached beneath the handlebars. James picked one up. It read, Ride safely, and when you're able, help someone else along the way. James smiled. I know that message. Samuel looked at him. So do I. James looked around the workshop once more. How long have you been doing this? Samuel thought for a moment. I honestly don't remember. Bill laughed. 45 years. Samuel shrugged. Has it been that long? Bill looked at James. He says that every time. Everyone laughed. James walked slowly through the workshop. On one wall, hundreds of photographs had been pinned to a large bulletin board. Children smiling beside bicycles. Families. School graduations. Young adults. Wedding photographs. Military uniforms. Police uniforms. Firefighters. Doctors. Teachers. Some photographs were faded almost beyond recognition. Others looked only weeks old. James stopped. Who are all these people? Samuel walked beside him. They're children. James smiled. They're adults. Samuel looked at the photographs for a long moment. They were children the first time I met them. Silence settled over the room. Not awkward, just thoughtful. James studied the faces. There had to be hundreds, perhaps more. Each photograph represented a story, a family, a beginning. He looked back at Samuel. You kept all of them? Samuel smiled softly. They sent them. I simply never had the heart to throw them away. Bill folded his arms. You know what the funniest part is? James looked at him. Most of them think they're thanking Sam for a bicycle. Bill shook his head. But they aren't. James frowned. What do you mean? Bill looked around the workshop. They're thanking him for believing in them, before they believed in themselves. The room fell completely silent. Even Samuel said nothing, because there was nothing to add. James looked once more at the wall of photographs. For the first time, he wasn't looking at bicycles anymore. He was looking at lives. Lives that had quietly changed direction because one man had decided that broken bicycles deserved another chance. And perhaps, so did people. As James prepared to leave, Samuel walked him to the door. The ceremony is tonight. James nodded. I'll be there. Samuel smiled. So will I. James laughed. I suppose that's obvious. Samuel looked back into the workshop, at the volunteers, the bicycles, the laughter. Then quietly said something James would remember for the rest of his life. You know, James, a bicycle isn't really what we give away. James looked at him. Samuel smiled. We give children a reason to believe that someone they have never met thought they were worth the effort. James stood silently, unable to answer, because somewhere deep inside, he realized that was exactly what Samuel had done for him the morning he had smiled, instead of complaining about a missing reflector. The Community Service Awards had been part of Maplewood for as long as anyone could remember. Every spring the town gathered inside the old Civic Center. Teachers, firefighters, police officers, business owners, volunteers, families. The evening was never extravagant. There were no television cameras, no famous guests, only neighbors celebrating neighbors. James arrived early. Rows of chairs slowly filled. Children whispered excitedly. Elderly couples greeted old friends. Volunteers from local charities laughed together near the entrance. The room carried the comfortable warmth of people who genuinely enjoyed seeing one another. James noticed something curious. Nearly everyone seemed to be looking toward the entrance from time to time, as though they were waiting. Chief Robert Hayes walked over, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "I had a feeling you'd get here early." James smiled. "I've been looking forward to tonight." The chief handed him one of the cups. "So have I." James hesitated. "Chief, can I ask one last time?" The older officer laughed softly. "I know. Who is Samuel Turner?" James nodded. Chief Hayes looked around the room, then smiled. "I could tell you." James leaned forward. "But if I did, you'd remember my words." The chief looked toward the stage. "I'd rather you remember tonight." Before James could answer, the lights dimmed. Conversations slowly faded. The mayor stepped to the podium. "Good evening, everyone." Warm applause filled the room. The mayor smiled. "Every year, we recognize people who quietly make Maplewood a better place." Awards followed. A volunteer firefighter, a high school teacher, a group of teenagers who had restored the town's walking trails. Each received heartfelt applause. James applauded with everyone else, but he couldn't help noticing that Samuel hadn't arrived. Not yet. Several empty seats remained near the front. One belonged to him, or so James assumed. Then the mayor returned to the podium. "Our final recognition this evening," she paused, "is a little different." The audience grew quiet. This award has never been presented before. James glanced toward Chief Hayes. The older officer simply smiled. The mayor continued. "Some people improve a community through one extraordinary act." She paused again. "Others improve it one ordinary act at a time." The room became completely silent. For more than 4 decades, one resident has quietly reminded all of us that kindness is not measured by headlines, but by consistency. James felt his heartbeat quicken. He already knew. The mayor looked toward the entrance. "Samuel, if you would join us." The doors at the back of the Civic Center opened. Samuel stepped inside. He wore the same gray jacket, the same polished shoes, the same warm smile. Nothing about him suggested he expected an audience. In fact, he looked slightly uncomfortable, as though he would rather be repairing bicycles. The room rose to its feet, not all at once, row by row, almost like a wave moving across the hall. James stood too, then looked around. No one had been asked to stand. No one had been prompted. It simply happened. The applause began softly, then grew stronger and stronger. James looked toward Samuel. The old man seemed almost embarrassed. He placed one hand over his heart, then quietly shook his head, as though trying to say, "This really isn't necessary." Chief Hayes leaned toward James. "It is." James swallowed. He suddenly understood. This wasn't applause for a speech or an award. It was gratitude. Years of it. Samuel slowly made his way toward the stage. But he couldn't take more than a few steps without someone gently touching his shoulder, shaking his hand, thanking him. A young mother hugged him. An elderly man squeezed his hand. A little boy proudly waved from the second row. Samuel greeted every one of them by name. Everyone. James whispered almost to himself. He remembers everyone. Chief Hayes nodded. He always has. When Samuel finally reached the stage, the applause continued. The mayor smiled warmly. Samuel, I don't think Maplewood has ever agreed on anything as completely as this. Soft laughter moved through the room. Samuel smiled shyly. I was hoping to stay in the audience. The mayor laughed. I know, which is exactly why you belong up here. More laughter. Then the room grew quiet again. The mayor unfolded a single sheet of paper, then looked at Samuel. For 45 years you have repaired bicycles. Samuel smiled. A few. Gentle laughter filled the room. The mayor smiled too. Our volunteers counted. She looked toward the audience. 2,412. A collective gasp spread through the hall. Samuel looked surprised. I had no idea. The mayor nodded. Neither did we. Silence settled over the audience. Not because of the number, because every person in the room suddenly realized this quiet man, who rode an old bicycle through town, had quietly changed thousands of childhoods. The applause slowly faded, but no one sat down. The mayor looked across the audience, then smiled. There is one more reason we wanted tonight to be different. She folded the paper in her hands. Normally, we tell people why someone deserves an award. She glanced toward Samuel. This evening, tonight we thought it might be better if the community told the story. The mayor looked toward the first row. Chief Hayes, would you join us? James turned in surprise. The police chief stood. The audience applauded once more as he walked onto the stage. The chief stopped beside Samuel. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then, to everyone's surprise, Chief Hayes embraced him. Not formally, not ceremonially, like family. When he stepped back, his voice was noticeably softer. I was 11 years old. He began. My father had just lost his job. My mother worked nights. We couldn't afford much. He smiled at Samuel. But one Saturday morning, this man knocked on our front door. He wheeled a blue bicycle into our yard. James felt his heart skip. Chief Hayes continued. I told him, we can't pay for that. He smiled. And do you know what he said? The chief laughed quietly. Good, because it's already been paid for. The chief looked at Samuel. I rode that bicycle to my first summer job. My first day of high school. My first date. And he smiled. My first day at the police academy. Silence filled the civic center. I don't know whether I would have become a police officer if I hadn't had that bicycle. He turned toward Samuel. So thank you. The audience applauded again. Not loudly, warmly, the kind of applause that comes from shared memories. The mayor smiled. I think someone else would like to speak. A woman stood from the third row. She wore a white doctor's coat beneath her light jacket. She looked toward Samuel. My name is Dr. Lisa Chen. She smiled. Although, you still call me Little Lisa. The room laughed. I was 9. My mother worked 2 jobs. I walked everywhere. Samuel lowered his eyes modestly. Lisa continued. You gave me my first bicycle. I used it to deliver newspapers. I saved enough money to buy my first science books. She smiled through tears. And eventually, to become a doctor. She looked directly at Samuel. You probably don't remember. Samuel smiled gently. You wanted a purple bicycle. Lisa laughed. I did. You couldn't find purple paint, so you mixed blue and red together. The audience laughed warmly. Lisa nodded. It wasn't perfect. It was beautiful. She stepped forward and hugged Samuel tightly. James looked around the room. People were smiling through tears. He suddenly understood. This wasn't an award ceremony anymore. It was a reunion. The mayor looked toward another row. Mr. Alvarez, an elderly man, slowly stood. He carried a walking cane. I won't keep everyone long. He smiled. I simply want to tell you that 42 years ago, Sam repaired my son's bicycle. My son has been repairing bicycles for children ever since. He pointed toward the audience. My grandson volunteers at Second Wheels. Then another hand went up, and another. A firefighter, a teacher, a mechanic, a florist. One after another people stood, not to praise Samuel, but to tell what happened after they met him. James began noticing something remarkable. Almost every story ended the same way. So I decided to help someone else, and I remembered what Sam taught me. Then I paid it forward. So now we volunteer, because kindness shouldn't stop with us. James suddenly remembered the little boy, whose bicycle chain Samuel had repaired. He remembered the father reaching for his wallet, and Samuel saying, "Next time someone needs help, you help them." James felt a quiet shiver. That wasn't simply something Samuel believed. It was how Maplewood had been built. Not through one man's kindness, through thousands of acts that began with one. The mayor allowed the applause to settle, then looked toward Samuel. Sam, I think you've started something much larger than bicycles. Samuel looked around the room, at the people, at the smiles, at the generations sitting together. Then he quietly shook his head. No. The room became silent. I didn't start it. Everyone looked at him. My father did. He smiled softly. When I was 8 years old, I found an injured bird. I brought it home. My father helped me care for it. When it finally flew away, I asked him, "How do we know if we did enough?" Samuel looked toward the audience. My father smiled, and he said, "You'll know when someone you help helps someone else." Samuel looked around the civic center. His eyes became moist. I think my father would have been very happy tonight. There wasn't a dry eye in the room, not even James, because he finally understood. Samuel had never wanted people to remember him. He had wanted them to remember each other.